to dive into pricing and getting work. I'm really focusing on this from kind of a freelance, independent angle. I've been freelance or independent really the better part of a decade, and so that's what I know the most. I've never held a full-time position with a design technology company. Definitely considered it, but I've worked hourly, I've worked with daily rates, weekly rates, and I've worked on project rates. And there's always been negotiation. I've definitely made some really bad decisions, and I've made a lot of mistakes with money. So I'm going to start off here by referencing an article I wrote some time ago. A guy emailed me and asked me lots of questions about money and how to deal with clients and all that. So I'm going to reference that as I kind of talk through these things and give you a few other references for books and articles and other ways to kind of get started if this is something that you're interested in. I also wrote a book, I think I wrote this back in 2013. I was writing a book called Freelance Fire, and it was kind of like a personal journey, just a personal documentation from my very first freelance project up until like 2013. So it is 7 years old or so, and I actually never finished it. I just kind of let it fizzle, but it takes about 45 minutes to read. I'm going to link that below as well. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump into some of these questions, and hopefully this will answer some things that have been going on in your mind. So let's get started. All right, number one, how do you estimate the amount of money you should receive for a project? By number of screens, the content, or what? I would start this off by asking the client, when do they need the work finished versus how soon can I realistically complete the work? In other words, is this a rush job or is the timeline a reasonable one? If you're estimating a project based on a fixed price, you also have to have a fixed timeline and a fixed payment schedule. It's not fair to you as the service provider, as the designer, to provide work on an indefinite schedule without a definite payment plan. Not only do you lose money by spending unaccounted time on a project, but you lose motivation, you might start to resent the client, and you lose other opportunities to pursue the projects that could be scheduled during your unaccounted time spillage. So if you estimate the work to be 2 weeks of heads down design, you still need to factor in client reviews, Google Hangouts, Zoom, or if you can even meet in person, although with social distancing, maybe you're not doing that. So I like to factor in at least a day or two for presentations, maybe every week presentation and revision, and then have the client provide written feedback to solidify what was discussed during the meeting. So you're going to need to lead this process. Otherwise, the client will just do what comes naturally, and they'll start saying, what if we did this? What if we did that? Can you try that? What about this completely different concept? So if you don't have some type of process in place, you'll start to squirm in your chair, unsure of how to deal with the feedback and this mountain of unexpected work that the client is proposing. So you have to kind of take charge of creating the scope of work that you're going to produce before it kind of gets out of hand. And honestly, these are all honest questions. So be prepared to tell him or her that it's out of scope, or alternatively, you could do the extra work, but it would require a change order or a change in deliverables, change in price. So sometimes you can, oh yeah, we can do the app icon, but that's actually going to take me another week. So that'll be another hundreds or thousands of dollars that you would charge to do that. So just use your best judgment when handling those types of use cases. Sometimes you can create some really high value by throwing in a little extra work on top, but let it be on your terms and not theirs. So before you begin a project, make sure you take the lead as a project manager, clearly outlining the timeline, the scope, the deliverables, the payment plans, etc. Otherwise, you'll have a never-ending spiral of emails, time wasted, and possibly more. You'll end up making exponentially less money than you originally thought once all of that starts to happen, once all that time gets sucked into a vacuum. So the number of screens might be a good starting point to figuring how much time it'll take you to complete the designs, but sometimes a client might be more curious about your hourly rate, or if you prefer to give an estimate for the project. So think about it from the client's perspective. If you were hiring a designer to create a certain number of screens, would you be willing to pay an hourly rate without having an idea of how long it would take? So whether you're billing hourly or on a fixed rate, you're going to need to come up with a realistic estimation of how long the project will take. And your estimations will probably suck at first, and they'll get progressively better as you gain more experience. So it's a good idea to start with some smaller projects, maybe 1 to 2 weeks at first, so you don't completely mess yourself up by doing a horrible job estimating a 3-month project with a fixed rate when it actually takes 5 or 6 months. I've done that before, and it totally really sucked. I'm not sure about design wages everywhere outside of the US, but in the US, hiring a designer it might cost you anywhere from $15 to $20 an hour up to $150 to $250 an hour, maybe even more, depending on when you're watching this. It's based on experience, proficiency, and a good rule of thumb is you're going to get what you pay for. So I'd suggest thinking of an hourly rate you'd be happy with earning for a project, and then maybe use that as a multiplier. If you'd be content with receiving $50 an hour for a project that you'd estimate at 1 week or 40 hours, then you'd be looking at $2,000 for the project. So just be sure to think about how you're willing to handle revisions, reviews, etc. And if you're actually going to bill every single 8-hour block of every day. So you can kind of use your hourly rate as a multiplier. So it's like, okay, if this is a 4-week project, if there are 160 hours in those 4 weeks of time, and I'm going to be working 160 of those hours, and I'm charging $100 per hour, then on that, I might make $16,000 on that project. And then you need to start thinking about, okay, maybe I should ask for half up front. Maybe I should ask for maybe a quarter of it up front. But usually I would always just start using that hourly rate as a multiplier. And then maybe that eventually turns into a weekly rate or a monthly rate. And you're not going to know what to charge until you try to start charging that. You can start at $100 an hour. You might want to start at $50 an hour. I've charged $15 an hour. I've charged $25 on up to $80, $90, $100. I've even charged $250 an hour before. But when you're paying for an hour of time, the thought of handing someone $250 for an hour of time for a long period of time, that starts to feel like not that good of a deal, because who wants to just pay for an hour? You're not really receiving any particular value for just an hour of time unless it's directly tied to, okay, my app is getting designed, my website's getting designed, and this is a cap of time. So anytime I've had an hourly rate that was great for me, but it was kind of like pushing the boundaries of what was possible, ultimately that project ended up stopping, because it's not going to be beneficial for a client to pay that much long term unless it's intrinsically tied to the value that you are receiving. So ultimately, while hourly pricing is a great place to start, it's really easy to just do a lowish to medium-ish reasonable hourly rate and just kind of do like that. Maybe it's like, okay, we'll do up to 20 hours a week. I'll bill you every 2 weeks, and you kind of agree to some deliverables. That's a good starting point. But ultimately that's going to break down. Let's say there's a design project and I'm going to charge $250 for 1 hour of work. It's just going to be boom. And then I'm going to charge you and we're done. There's another designer who's going to charge $50 an hour for the same exact project, but they estimate it's going to take 5 hours of their time. So they work on it for 5 hours, boom, they're done, $250. So which one is more valuable, assuming that they are producing the same quality of work? Well, the one that is working 5 times faster is more valuable than the one that's working 5 times slower, but it's the same price. So it's like, if I'm doing it faster and just as good, how am I making the same amount of money as someone who's doing it slower and doing a good job but much, much slower? So at a certain point, the hourly rate starts to penalize the client if I'm slow. If that same project took me 2 hours, then they got to pay $500. And if it took me 4 hours, they're paying $1,000. So at a certain point, the client is getting penalized for me going slow and being inefficient. But then I get penalized if I go too fast. So I tend to not do as much hourly billing now. I used to a lot in the past, especially if you're contracting with an agency or you're working as a contractor within another group and most of the billing is time-based, most of the time you're going to be billing hourly. So sometimes you might have to do that. But let me go on with the next question. Given that it'll be a fixed price payment, do you prefer payment at the end or by milestone? Well, this depends on a few things. How bad do you need the money? How much do you trust the client? Is this a huge expense for the client, or is this a small expense for the client? Is this a huge project for you, or is it a small one or a medium one? If you need money quickly, then you should absolutely ask for money up front. This also serves as earnest money from the client that will let you know that he or she or they are serious about hiring you for the project. The project is not a project until you have an agreement about payment or preferably money in the bank. If it's a small project from someone you trust, then you should feel comfortable doing the work, sending an invoice, and collecting payment afterwards. Sometimes it might be also, they might be willing to pay you up front. That's no problem either. Even so, you'll need an agreement about when you get paid. It's best to say X amount due by X date with no strings attached. Make it simple and straightforward. You and the client both need to know the payment plan. I've done projects based on a pie in the sky estimate, which was verbally agreed to by the client, and I had no plan in place for deliverables or payment or timeline. And I got most of the way through the designs and the client became non-responsive to emails or phone calls. I sent them the invoice, just kind of being like, well, I guess I'm just going to invoice them, and never got paid. And I blame myself for not having a solid agreement in place. Now, this is many, many years ago when I was first starting out and I just didn't know what I was doing. So the same goes for your design deliverables. Put in writing what you'll be responsible for, when you will deliver the final version, the final Figma file. This way there's no confusion over what the client is expecting and what you are planning to deliver. You can break up a fixed rate project into quarter payments, but it really warrants a discussion between you and the client. Again, communication is key. It may be a hassle for the client to have to write 4 different checks over the course of a month instead of 2 or 1. And likewise, it could be a hassle for you to send 4 invoices, especially for a project with a short timeline. So, keep it simple. You might want to do 50% up front, collect 50% on the end. You can break it up however, and this is always going to be negotiable based on you and the client. But quality clients should be willing to pay some money up front. When I hired developers to build out little things for me, I will always pay them up front if it's a project-based thing. I'll give them half up front and then pay them half when they're done. It's just an easy way to keep it organized. And if I'm hiring a contractor and then they're keeping hours, or maybe we have project-based rate, I'm going to pay them at the milestones that we agree on. No one should be wondering when their money is going to be coming. And if you have to do that with a client, then that's just not a good relationship. So you need to pin that down up front before you get started. For a scrolling screen, which sometimes would be long, do you consider it as 1 screen or 2? To this question, I would say I wouldn't tie your pricing or estimate to a general screen count. You need to think about it a little more contextually. So like one scrolling screen could take 1 day or 30 days, depending on how many components are within the content. So it's fine to call 1 screen or 1 section, but not to estimate it as one thing. You'll need to break it down into sections. I like to break it down into sections, even if that's going to be 1 screen might have 8 sections or 8 screens might have 8 sections. It doesn't matter how many screens necessarily. It matters how much content am I going to be designing for, and just kind of categorically going through and listing out everything. Think about it even further. Do the sections, are they going to need custom illustrations or icons? Do you need to do any photography or copywriting? All of these tasks need to be factored into your estimate and will ultimately add it up to be 1 screen or 1 section. Maybe you need to discuss, are you going to provide any assets? What is involved? Ask those questions up front before you have to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to design this. And then later you realize they wanted a 3D rendering on the home screen, but you don't actually do 3D rendering. So now you're at an impasse where you have to either say, yeah, but we agreed to that. But they're like, well, we want a 3D rendering. And you have to make sure that you set that expectation up front before you dive into the work. Just make sure there's no gray area in your communication with the client in terms of defining things. Iron out all the details of the content you'll produce as well as the payment you will receive. How do you report your progress to the client? By email or Zoom or InVision app? How do you do that? So I use mostly email for standard communication for dates, progress, notes, meetings, questions, etc. Sometimes Basecamp for larger projects. Sometimes even bigger clients will have their own internal tool. Maybe we even spin up a temporary Slack workspace. I'm not a big fan of having open text message communication directly with the client from the very beginning, unless it's a trusted client who has earned the right to have direct access to me and knows how to respect that. InVision can be good for showing prototypes or Figma prototypes. It just really depends on your project. So for me in particular, how fast do I work? 1 screen per hour, 1 screen per day? Well, the biggest thing to remember is that quality work takes time no matter how experienced you are. I don't like to give myself less than a full day to work on anything substantial, and it's typically better to allow 2 to 3 days, maybe even a week minimum to work on one project, as you need to get to sleep on your decisions and get ideas about better treatments, implementations, etc. over that stretch of time. In general though, I do work very fast and efficient, but I also see that as being extremely valuable as opposed to being thought of as efficient and cheap labor. This is where billing hourly versus billing for value comes into play. And I'm going to link to a bunch of articles and books by Dan Mall, who talks a lot about this if you want to dive more into the world of value-based pricing, which is definitely a good thing to start reading about and start learning about. Could you provide the number of screens and the amount of payment that you received? It would be nice if there was some magical design menu that everyone could pull from and grab prices, but unfortunately it does not exist in the real world. I don't mind sharing the details of any projects that I've worked on and payment that I've received, but you wouldn't have a strong context for the scenario surrounding the deal for it to provide any real value. Even if you have a project and you ask how many screens, how much money, I wouldn't necessarily have enough information about your project to give a good estimate, and you wouldn't know enough about my pricing process for it to provide any real value to you in terms of what are my expenses every month, and what am I striving towards, what am I trying to do. All of the clients value their hopes, dreams, and fears, and the designer's hopes, dreams, and fears, and all of that kind of comes into play, and you really have to figure out what works best for you. I can't just spit off like, yeah, you need to definitely be charging $75 an hour. I might be able to sit down with you for an hour and ask you a bunch of questions and then make a recommendation, but just a blanket statement, it's hard to answer. And so you're going to have to do that hard work of knowing what is the lowest amount that you're willing to do the work for? What is your ideal amount? And what is your oh my gosh, this would be crazy amount if you were able to make that amount? And, don't take anything less than this minimum amount. And ideally, bump it a little bit high because probably you're shortchanging yourself. Brennan Dunn has a great course about double your freelancing rate. That's a great thing to look into as well. He writes a lot about pricing, so you could also check his stuff out. So I'm also going to include a master service agreement and an SOW template statement of work down below for you to check out, for you to use. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit more about the differences between hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, and even project-based pricing. I've already kind of covered hourly, that it's a good place to start, but as you slowly increase, maybe you start off $20 an hour, maybe you start off at $50 an hour. If you have a salaried position, maybe you break down your hourly rate from there and you go a little bit higher. Maybe you come home and you work in the evenings for an X amount hourly rate. Maybe you don't do hourly at all. It's really up to you, and it's up to the client that you're working with based on how that's going to work out. But I would always encourage you to experiment with increasing your rate a little by little. And I got to tell you, as you do that, you will lose projects. I've lost so many projects because I quoted really high, and I've even had people say, I can't believe you would charge that for a website. Well, it's like, sorry, I have charged that for a website before, and if you don't want to pay, that's totally fine. So you might get insulted, but it's worth experimenting because you could be leaving money on the table. If I am willing to pay someone $20,000 to create a great sound studio, set up lighting and audio, and I'm like, man, I would pay $20,000 for somebody to come in and set it all up and get it all perfectly set up. And then when I go to hire someone to do that, and they say, oh yeah, I could probably do that for like $5,000. They just left $15,000 on the table because I'm thinking, and also I might be thinking to myself, only 5,000? Like maybe they don't do that quality of work. So there's a really big psychological factor here. There's another great book called Mindless Eating, and it's a book about food and psychology, but it's really about psychology. I'd also recommend that book. But in that book, they talk about an experiment that they ran where they brought people into a restaurant and they gave group A one hamburger and group B the same exact hamburger. But group A, it was just like standard hamburger, mustard, ketchup, whatever, $3. There's your hamburger. Group B, they served it on a fancy plate. The menu said char grilled, artisanal bun, fresh squeezed ketchup, whatever, the fancy adjectives, nice design, nice lighting, but the same exact hamburger, exactly the same food. But at the Group B restaurant, they said this burger costs $15. This one was like $3. I could be getting the details wrong, but it was something like that. And they interviewed everyone that came out of the restaurant, and Group A by far, I don't remember the exact percentages, but Group A by far didn't have as many nice things to say about the burger than Group B. It was the exact same burger, and they had a lot of people in the experiment. And Group B said it tastes better, that they would buy it again, and they enjoyed it more. And it was something like 30 to 40% better overall, that group B enjoyed it. If you're charging more, then the perceived value is going to be higher. If you're charging less, the chance of the perceived value being less is there as well. So that's also something to consider. So if you talk to a potential client and in their mind, they're thinking, we've got about $10,000 for this project, but then you come in and without asking any questions or fishing for a budget or whatever, a good question to ask could be, are you willing, what are you thinking in terms of budget? Is this something like $100 project, $1,000 project, or a $10,000 project? Or maybe you say, is this like a $2,000 project or a $20,000 project or a $200,000 project? Sometimes you can draw out a little bit of information. Sometimes you can't. That's the tricky thing about pricing. So it's just kind of this constant experiment that has some, there are some tools that you can use, but it's also an experiment. And it's also based on how bad do you need that project. If you need something really bad, you don't have any money, then you don't have a lot of room to negotiate. You'll basically take whatever they offer you. And I've been in that position so many times. But then as you build up your own personal finance little nest egg and you have maybe 3 to 6 months expenses or more, then you have a lot more negotiating power. You don't have to just take that project right away. You can say, well, wait a second. You can start talking about budget and the work, and you say, I'm really looking for something in the $10,000 price range, so I'm gonna kind of pass on the $1,000 projects. Or maybe you want to do it. You have a lot more flexibility when you aren't starving. So when you're starving, you'll eat anything. But if you're planning a dinner out with some friends and you're not starving, you have a lot more choice available. You can plan, like, we'll drive 20 minutes to the other restaurant, or maybe you order something and they deliver it with a mask on. So you have a lot more choice when you're not starving and when you don't need something immediately. So that's another thing to consider. One more thing that I almost forgot. The best ways to get work. Let people know that you are available and that you're looking for XYZ type of work. Post your work online to Twitter, Dribbble, Instagram. Make sure the type of work that you're posting is the kind of work that you want to get, assuming that you are looking for work. Don't post a bunch of t-shirt designs if you're looking for mobile app design work. If your portfolio has a bunch of logos in it and you're trying to look for responsive web app work, then it's gonna be a little bit more difficult for somebody to look at your portfolio and say, oh, they know all about design systems and components and forms. If it just has a bunch of logos and photographs, that connection's gonna be a little bit harder to make. If I want someone to come in here, have an engineer and soundproof everything, and I look at their portfolio and all they've done is install sinks and tile bathrooms, I'm gonna say, I don't think I'm gonna hire that person to come do that type of work. So just put out that kind of work that you want to get. I remember back in 2008, 2009, I designed my very first iPhone app. It was just like a simple little 3-screen app. And I remember getting contacted by someone at an agency in Atlanta, and they were looking online in my portfolio and they were like, oh, I see that you have mobile experience. We actually have a mobile project that we're trying to work on. And I was like, yeah, I do have a mobile experience. And I might not have been the most mobile experienced designer, but I did have some mobile experience because she saw that project in my portfolio, and that led those conversations in a direction that allowed me to get that other project that I worked on with them. So the more you put out, the more people are going to know you for that. And it's not like you're not going to paint yourself into a corner. You could always pivot to something else. If you want to start doing hand lettering, start writing hand lettering on an Instagram account. You can do multiple things. I used to get trapped into that mindset of, well, if I'm always doing this and people aren't going to know that I do that. And there's really not really any benefit to getting too limited in your mindset, because there is always going to be more work available out there that you just are unaware of. You just have to kind of continue to put yourself out there, find those connections, reach out to those people, be sociable online with people who work at companies that you'd like to do work for, or maybe you'd even like to join them. DM other designers and ask them simple or direct questions about what it's like to work there, or what's the interview process like at that company. And you can just start being friendly. And this is really a way to making friends in the tech industry, is a way to build your network, but just not in a sleazy networking kind of way. Building friends, making friendships, being kind, that is how you build your network. And then when you do get hired by someone, make sure you do a great job. Make sure you don't burn someone. Make sure you're not a stick in the mud or a jerk or just not fun to work with. Be kind and make every single person on the team feel like you valued them and you respected them, and let people know what you're going to do. Say what you're going to do. Let people know why you aren't going to be at that meeting. Don't just let people guess your status. So the more that you can put good work out and good vibes out into the atmosphere, the more people are going to know you for being that type of person and doing that type of work. It's all connected. Price and working together, getting work, it's just all connected. So I hope this helps you, and thanks so much for watching.